Okay, let's unpack this. When you look at the deep divides in society today, what everyone calls the culture war, we tend to think about them in, political terms, policy. But what if those battles are just the surface? What if the real conflict is uh, much deeper, a philosophical dispute about reality itself, specifically about the status of human consciousness?
That's the really fascinating premise from the source material we're looking at for this deep dive. It's suggesting that this whole tension, individualism versus collectivism, it all boils down to one question. Is consciousness primarily spatial? Is it this all-encompassing fabric that we're all sort of diluted into? Or is it primarily temporal, something rooted in the present moment, connected through history, memory, ancestry, something that defines the individual?
And that's our mission today, to follow this
Yeah.
thesis and really understand the consequences for you, for your sense of self, your place in the world, depending on which of these views wins out.
Exactly. Because these aren't just abstract ideas, they fundamentally dictate the relationship between you and the group.
So let's start with that first poll, the spatial hypothesis. There's a real movement growing right now. You see it everywhere, spiritual circles, philosophy, even some science, pushing this idea that consciousness is, quote, all around us.
That it's the fabric of the universe. And I mean, it's often presented as this really admirable project. The idea is that if we believe consciousness is this shared, extended thing, we can finally dissolve the psychological barriers that divide us.
From each other, from nature.
Yeah.
It promises a kind of universal unity.
It does. It sounds great on the surface.
But the source material we've got also raises some, let's say, pretty serious criticisms about why this view is gaining so much steam right now.
It really does. The material points out that its popularity seems, well, heavily influenced by the progressive agenda in academia and media. The argument is that, many academics already lean towards collectivist ideas, and while others might just be adjusting their message to get attention.
So the critique is a bit cynical. It's suggesting that the idea is popular because it's intellectually fashionable, that it helps you get funding or attention.
It's an intellectual economy, in a way, driven by alignment.
That's a strong claim. But okay, let's set the motivations aside for a second and focus on the structural flaw the sources identify. Why is the spatial view, even if it's well-intentioned, a problem?
The problem is, it's almost a geometric one. If you define consciousness as an extension in space, you run into a fatal flaw. Space, by its very nature, is divisible.
Meaning point A is always separate from point B.
Exactly. Space is defined by separation. So if consciousness is just a fabric that exists in space, it's something that can be cut up, delineated.
So you're saying the goal is unity, but the container space is built on the logic of separation. That's a massive contradiction.
A huge one. If I can draw a line and say this is my space and that's your space, or the Earth's space versus the Moon's space, then the oneness is just. Yeah. It's an illusion. It's fragile.
It seems like it would require this constant effort to pretend that space isn't divisible, even though it is.
Precisely. And what this highlights is that just because we share time together, this irreversible flow of moments, that doesn't automatically mean we share space in a way that dissolves our boundaries. And that distinction is really the linchpin here.
Okay, that structural flaw is compelling.
Yeah.
But this is where the argument gets really interesting, because the core rebuttal isn't just about geometry. It's about our own deepest human experiences.
Yes, this is where it pivots to phenomenology, to the actual experience of transcendence.
That profound feeling of oneness.
Exactly, the kind of thing mystics and philosophers talk about. And the key insight from the source is that this experience of unity actually defies the whole notion of extension of space.
That's counterintuitive. Most people, when they describe that feeling, they reach for spatial words, right? I felt connected to the whole universe. I was one with everything.
They do. They map it onto the biggest concept of space they can think of. But the sources argue the real experience is the opposite. That feeling of unity is not a connection with vast space. It's a connection with no space at all, just the present moment.
So it's not about merging with everything out there. It's about a reality that's just intensely rooted in the now.
That's the temporal connection completely overriding the spatial one. Transcendence doesn't just dissolve the boundary of your body, it dissolves space itself. The very thing we use to measure separation just disappears.
Okay, but what about that feeling then? The feeling of being interwoven with the galaxies.
Yeah.
Is the argument that that specific part, the vastness, is an error?
According to this analysis, yes. That expansive spatial feeling is described as an afterthought. And to understand that, we have to bring in this psychological concept of the narrative interpreter.
Let's define that.
The narrative interpreter is basically the brain's internal storyteller. It's a function, mostly in the left hemisphere, that's always trying to create a coherent story out of all our experiences. So when this overwhelming non-spatial experience of transcendence happens, just pure awareness in time, the interpreter kicks in afterwards and tries to make sense of it.
And the only tool it has is space.
The only tool it has is space. It tries to map this feeling of absolute connection onto a physical, measurable frame. So an experience of no space gets misinterpreted as an experience of vast space.
Wow. So the source of connection shifts entirely. It's not out there in the cosmos. It's right here in the intangible flow of time.
Exactly.
So let's bring this back down to Earth. What does this whole thing, spatial versus temporal consciousness, actually mean for me, for the listener, in their daily life?
Well, this is where it gets incredibly practical. The consequences for your identity are just enormous. This philosophical dispute maps perfectly onto our social and political tensions.
Okay, so lay out the two paths. What happens if we go with the spatial option?
If society decides consciousness is everywhere, that we're all just parts of one big collective fabric, it inevitably dilutes the individual into the collective.
Your own unique story, your personal history, it all becomes secondary.
It does. Your identity stops being about your life and starts being about which group you belong to. And if the collective fabric is the ultimate reality, then any individual who deviates...
It's seen as a tear in the fabric, a problem to be fixed.
Precisely. Individual rights become less important than maintaining that all-encompassing shared space. Yourself is no longer a fixed point.
And the temporal option, what does that imply?
The temporal option suggests the opposite, that the individual is independent of the group. You're still connected, of course, but through the shared river of time, not by being dissolved into a spatial ocean.
That sounds like it comes with a radical sense of personal responsibility.
It absolutely does. Your unique self isn't dissolved, it's a singular, irreplaceable point on a timeline. Connection is about empathy, shared experience, not a structural merger.
Okay, let's go a bit deeper on the temporal side, because it brings up this concept that can feel a little abstract, the ancestral spirit.
Right, and the source material is very clear that if society goes fully spatial, this vital temporal link will be lost.
Why is it so important?
Because it provides a profound stabilizing effect on the individual. When you see yourself as part of a historical stream, standing on a foundation built by generations, you gain an anchor that goes way beyond the chaos of the present moment.
The phrase ancestral spirit can sound a bit mystical, though.
Yeah.
How does the source ground that? What is it, really?
It clarifies it quite a bit, actually. It's not some ghost. It's defined as the accumulated emotional and moral inertia passed down through time. It's the echo of our ancestors' lives.
An echo of what, specifically?
Of their caring, the deep care and commitment they cultivated. The source mentions specifically the love they felt for each other, for their environment, and the sense of enduring commitment to the places they lived. It's a narrative of stability passed through time.
Ah, so it's an inherited sense of rootedness, a temporal stability that helps define who you are.
Exactly. It's an internal, non-material source of identity. But the modern person, often cut off from that, feels that lack of an anchor, even if they can't name it.
So when someone is oblivious to this temporal link, what do they substitute it with? Where do they look for that identity?
The sources point to two main coping mechanisms, and they're both spatial substitutions. First, the individual turns outward. They start identifying with material possessions instead.
They try to find permanence in things they can own and touch.
Yes, seeking stability in the external world, because the internal temporal one is gone. And the second mechanism is more insidious. They find themselves in causes that disguise their resentment.
What does that mean?
They look for a collective purpose, often framed with that same spatial desire for universal unity. But the real psychological driver is just a mask for their own individual instability. They substitute that ancestral rootedness with group affiliation, which often becomes aggressive toward anyone outside the group.
Which brings us right back to the start, the culture war. The search for a collective identity might just be a symptom of losing our individual temporal one.
It's a powerful connection to make, isn't it? The pressure to conform, the aggressive group identity. It all flourishes when the individual loses that internal, stabilizing connection to their own unique history. So if we step back and look at the whole picture, the conflict that's defining our time really is this agonizing choice. It's between an all-encompassing, divisible space, which risks diluting you into the collective, and a present moment, connective time, which offers stability and independence through your connection to ancestry. It's a conflict between definition and diffusion.
It really forces you to reconsider what belonging even means. And if that ultimate feeling of oneness, of transcendence, is truly about dissolving space into the present moment, then the deepest unity we can feel is temporal, not spatial. So the challenge we want to leave you with is this. If that's true, how does that authentic temporal experience of oneness reconcile our need for collective connection with the fierce independence that comes from our own unique ancestral link? How do you hold both at once?
That paradox is the continuous navigation. It's the core of the dilemma.
We encourage you to keep exploring the sources and the implications of this spatiotemporal divide. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.